Why don't we get started? There's a couple more stragglers that are supposed to come in, and we'll just leave the door open for them. Thank you all for coming to see this talk today. This is a work in progress, I've been told, and somebody who is looking for feedback on this first cut at this project. It's my real pleasure to welcome Ryan Murphy to the Tower Center today. He's Research Assistant Professor at the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom. You have his bio in front of you. You can see all the great things that he's been doing. And the topic of his working paper is Intergovernmental Organizations and Free Economic Institutions. With that, I will hand it over to you, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the Economic Freedom of the World Index. It's the primary author now is Robert Lawson. I work with him closely at the O'Neill Center. And what the Economic Freedom of the World Index does is it looks to measure what we call economic freedom. You can also call good economic institutions or economic liberalism in the kind of European sense of the word liberalism, where it's really more about absence of government intervention as opposed to positive freedom to have income or something to that effect. But so it's really comprised of five different measures. How small the government is, so you don't want the public sector to be too big. The quality of the legal system and ensuring that property rights are enforced. The soundness of money, so low inflation. And freedom to trade internationally, so low trade barriers, and a light regulatory environment. And since this index was constructed 20 years ago, it's been used primarily as what we economists say as a right-hand side variable. It's used to explain other things. But recently, we've been looking to figure out what explains economic freedom, what causes countries to become more economically free. I was seeing my office one day, and I saw some kind of conspiratorial literature from the far right about how different various international organizations are going to come to the United States and strip our freedom and take away our sovereignty and make us not have any carbon emissions and so on. But on the other hand, just intuitively, to me at least, it seems like an organization like the World Trade Organization should improve, at the very least, Area 4, the freedom to trade internationally. And so whatever else these organizations do, I would expect that many of them not to really have any impact at all, and the ones that do have an impact have a positive impact. But despite my priors, this is still a falsifiable hypothesis, and it's one that we can test with the data. So what I did was I collected data on membership in these intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations, NATO, OECD, European Union, and the GATT or WTO. And the way I targeted these organizations was just basically which ones would have the type of statistical data properties that would allow me to actually see what was going on in the data. So countries joining in at different times, large numbers of countries, and so that left out. So like I couldn't do like OPEC because of this. But the ones that are probably the most interesting, EU, really, it is possible to do that given the data. So this is what I've got. And if there's something else you think belongs here, I may not have thought of it. So feel free to offer that. And so, as I said, I expected that, UN, NATO, OECD not to have any real effect. European Union I thought would have mixed effects, but ultimately be positive just because the common market, intuitively to me at least, seemed like it would have the biggest impact, and that WTO really should have positive effects. But run the data, and it seems like it's generally negative. You could make the argument for all of them. And so just real quick, even though I've kind of given away my result, there has been other people who have tried to look into how intergovernmental organizations impact equality of institutions generally, although not necessarily economic freedom. And so all these are journal articles. Hone 2007 arguing that the impact of the EU at least doesn't really have that much of isn't really much there. And Lejour and Mouge suggested that the prospect of joining may temporarily improve the institutional effects in countries such as Turkey, but what's happened with Turkey today? Who knows if that's been true, if that was ever true at all? And Rowe is arguing that that GATT and WTO don't really have the impact on what we see in the patterns of trade data, although that's not really the same thing as the ability of people to trade internationally. So here comes the jargon with the econometrics and what I really did. So what it really was an unbalanced panel. So I have different countries, different years, and for my regressions of interest, I used year and country fixed effects. So if it's something that's specific to the country, that's constant over time, it really shouldn't matter in these estimates. And by controlling for year, if it's something specific to the year, or if it's like a trend over time, then it should also really be controlled for. And I looked at the membership in two different ways. The first one was just a dummy variable, so score 1 if you're a member of the intergovernmental organization, and 0 otherwise. And then the other is just the natural log of the number of years that the country has been a member. So just kind of like a smooth relationship over time in terms of allowing that to have an impact as well. And I just did two really basic controls, but controls that I think do capture a lot of the concerns that people might have is what am I looking at here? So polity 4 will pick up the general character of the government of the country. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with polity 4. It's basically democracy versus autocracy, with a lot of room in between for that. And I'm also controlling for logged real GDP per capita, which, among other things, will control for the general economic development of the country. So what I'm talking about here is not just a development story. I'm just picking up the fact that rich countries join these organizations, and rich countries, as countries get richer, there's some other impact on the quality of their economic freedom. But I do admit that I'm not going to aggressively say that this is I'm establishing causality here. There still could be other things going on in the data. It's just that these effects are of interest after doing this many controls, and it's something to be explained. And so these are the baseline results of the variables of interest with the controls in place and with the fixed effects in place. And so the membership dummy is just the 1-0 relationship. Are you a member? Are you not a member? And generally speaking, 1 point of economic freedom is, so 1 compared to 0.28, 1 would be a 1 standard deviation. And so these effects aren't really that small, but they aren't huge, but they're not trivial either. But you see that some of these signs are crossing based on whether or not it's whether or not you're a member and the length of time you've been a member. So just looking at on its face, it may not be clear how these things work, but in the next graph I'll show will establish how these things look like over time. But as you can see, that despite the fixed effects and everything, there is statistical significance in most of these estimates. And so in this next graph, I'm just going to take all the point estimates in the previous chart at face value, and just chart what they would look like over time. So there's 0 is like, so you're not a member. First year is the year dummy, and then the logged effect over time, where this is not, where we don't have a log scale in the x-axis here, going out 20 years. And so the UN is the one where it's like unambiguously, clearly bad, and the others seem like they have like a shock of a looks like it's a better impact, but then it's going down over time. And these aren't asymptotes, despite what it may look like. They are going to dip beneath 0 eventually. But what's the interpretation here? What are we even looking at? Well, there's 3 different things that I could really think of that's what might be going on here. And so there are direct effects of becoming a member. The WTO has certain regulations, NATO mandates, but people ignore certain amounts of military spending as a percent of GDP, and that would go into the size of government category and economic freedom. And as I mentioned before, the common market in the EU should have some direct impacts on the regulatory scores or the freedom to trade internationally scores. Then there might be some indirect effects of membership. So, like if countries are, if just by saddling closer to the United States or or other members of the international community, it might change the way politicians in those countries operate. A whole host of things that I don't really have clear visibility into. If anyone has any suggestions on what these indirect effects might actually entail. And then there's a question of I didn't really establish causality here, so these are just spurious relationships. And I'm sure that there are many other ideas that people can have of things I didn't control for, and fixed effects other ones would not control for adequately. But even if that's the case, then it's still interesting because it's saying that the type of countries that join, it's saying something negative about them, and that's something to be explained, and something that's interesting. So if normally we would see like a country is getting its act in order, its house in order, and say now joining the WTO, maybe we look at that, we're reading The Economist, we're reading the Wall Street Journal, and seeing that, it's like, oh, this was good news for this country. They want to open their doors to investment and so on, whatever. But joining these organizations may actually be a negative sign for us, counterintuitively. And so this is where things get interesting. There is a lot of weird directions signs in here, where it seems like things are going all over the place, and here it still might seem a little bit ambiguous. But if you just take those point estimates and apply them to the United States and said, what if the United States had never joined any of these organizations? That's the top line, and what the United States is currently is the bottom line. So I marked a few things right here where if the United States would have actually peaked at 9.9 out of 10, which no country has ever approached at all in economic freedom in 2000s, and we would still see a pattern of decline as we've seen generally in economic freedom in the United States over the past 12 years. But the gap between here and here is actually smaller than here and here. So if this is at all correct, not only did it have a big impact, like we're talking like more than one standard deviation here. It's an effect that's growing over time even. And so, but that kind of raises the question of what about free trade? I have all this other stuff in the index, but it seems like if these organizations are going to have a positive impact, then they should certainly have an impact on Area 4 freedom to trade. And if nothing else, what's the UN really have to say about free trade? What's NATO really have to say about free trade? But EU and WTO, how would they not have a positive impact on Area 4? So if I look into that and run the same exact specification as I did in the previous regression, but I just switch out the left-hand side variable of economic freedom, how do we explain that? And just have Area 4, so freedom to trade internationally. We're explaining that now. Then we're still getting roughly the same thing. We're getting negative signs on GATT or WTO, and something that's going to turn negative fairly quickly for the EU. And so, I know I'm finishing pretty quick here, but I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and if people want to get out early, I'm happy to give them time and not waste your time. I'm looking for some ideas, and so the first issue is that when I was feeding this data into the Excel, it seemed like the relationships were very, very closely tied. Once a country left the Iron Curtain, they would join one organization, and 2 years later they would join another, and then another, and another, and another. And the same type of pattern would hold, roughly speaking, with, of course, some exceptions. And those exceptions seem like they're enough, or the staggering of years seem like it's enough to see in the data what's going on. But that's still surprising to me, because generally when you have something this related to each other, in a regression, the regression begins having problems telling what is what. But that hasn't been the case. So maybe that's just because I got my sample size big enough. But if there's something that signals when you join one organization but not the other, or vice versa, that's something that I would need more insight into. And so it does seem strange, but what I had in one of my initial slides, just running the data, this doesn't seem ludicrously wrong. It's just too alarmist. And even if all these results I have are incorrect, and that the actual joining to the organizations isn't causing what's going on, I think it's very disturbing that when you do join, it says something about the country that is so negative about the economic institutions going forward. And so I know the John Birch Society story for those things, and I don't really believe the John Birch Society version of the events. But I would be very interested in knowing like a higher brow explanation for what's really going on in the data. And that's where my project is.
Great. Thank you. Well, we'll do some questions. I'll just ask a dumb question, because I'm not. This work is somewhat different from the sort of thing I do.
Mm-hmm.
But when you say you're looking for other interpretations, one that comes to mind is like John Eikenberry's interpretation that the U.S. since the end of World War II has deliberately not only built these structures, these IGOs, but it has involved itself into it, knowingly restricting its own behavior, right? Inhibiting itself. And the payoff is that more countries also join, therefore more and more countries are basically joining onto a U.S.-led world order. Mm-hmm. So is that a different interpretation from what you're getting at? Is that maybe less disturbing? Does that sound right to you? That this is less something foolish and disturbing, but something deliberate and a way of sort of exercising soft power? What do you think?
Well, that certainly makes sense in terms of, say, NATO, with getting everyone to join in and raise their spending on the military. But does it make sense that something like that would make countries throw up barriers to trade? Because it seemed like the narrative for much of the 20th century was that the United States foreign policy may not have done questionable things during the Cold War, but it seemed like in general it was on the side of opening markets. And so maybe there's bits of the story here that I'm not familiar with. But it seems to not rest perfectly easily with the idea that these organizations are somehow built to restrict trade.
Well, his argument is not that they're built to restrict trade, but they're built to inhibit the United States. But the payoff for that inhibition is that other states essentially agree to the basic idea of the U.S.-led world order, right? Other states look at the United States and say, if they're going to lock themselves into these kinds of restrictions, then we're much more comfortable being part of that system. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it might be something you want to look at as an alternative.
Just one more follow-up. How does he? What inhibitions is he really getting at in terms of?
So if you bind yourself to any sort of trade restrictions or restrictions on finance, monetary relations, and participation in international in things like the UN, you're signaling that you're not just an unfettered great power.
Okay.
if you think about the amount of capabilities concentrated in the United States, the argument is the rest of the world's looking for some sort of good faith effort or good faith signal that we're not just going to go off dominating.
Okay.
So I'm just saying, this is Eichenberry's argument. It's probably worth looking at.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Josh, an example of that might be the Obama administration's decision about the pipeline, looking forward to the negotiation of new climate change rules, because in a sense the United States is trying to set an example of being a good citizen in order to bring other countries along with it. So in that sense, perhaps that's an example of that kind of...
Keystone?
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and take questions since
Oh,
you're working?
sure.
Go ahead.
I work in the area of copyright a lot, and my question here would be what your indicators for economic freedom are. How do you define it? In the area of copyright, I belong to the more protectionist side. I'm a member of the Copyright Committee Association of American Publishers. Obviously, our view of what is best, in long-range economic terms, differs greatly from the electronic freedom frontier and the Googles of the world, who want to see much less restriction. Our interest is in controlling piracy more. Their interest is in opening things up more. So, which is the real definition of economic freedom in this kind of context? It could be either one, depending on
Yeah.
what you project the future results to be.
Well, the data isn't good enough for us to put intellectual property into the index, which is a good thing because there is an agreement among people like me as to whether or not intellectual property should count towards it one way or the other. So it's not in the index. Unless it's somehow correlated with one of our components in some weird way, then it shouldn't really be a concern for my results.
So you purposely exclude things that are like controversial like that?
Oh no. Well, if I shouldn't say that we purposely exclude things, but if the data existed, we would have a tough decision to make. Is what I'm saying. There, among the people who are proponents of economic freedom, you have people who are like widely divergent opinions. Ayn Rand is to your right, Murray Rothbard is distantly to your left. So
So a couple things. First of all, it strikes me that saying something is maximally free on your index is not necessarily, although this may be your own personal position, it's not necessarily the same thing as saying it's normatively good, right? That is, people could have different normative positions over where the right place on this scale to fall is. Because you could increase your freedom score theoretically by taking government spending all the way to zero. But nobody would say that's a good thing, right? To go to absolute zero in terms of government spending. So it's not automatically and always the case that a higher freedom score is better. Now, we might think generally that's the case, right? Or we might say that maybe the optimum score here is 9 or 9.5 or something. But I guess people could acknowledge that something has a negative impact on the freedom index without simultaneously saying, and therefore it's bad, right? I mean, that's a normative debate that's overlaid on top of the empirical debate.
yeah. So I would say that this presentation had my normative feelings overlaid the positive analysis, and the positive analysis is there, whatever you take from it. Maybe you think that it's great that secretly the WTO is undermining free trade, or
more plausibly, somebody might think it's good that governments are spending more money.
yes, of course. So like there's probably a few people in this room who think that the NATO requirements for military spending are a good thing. But what I'm saying is, regardless of that, the net effects of these IGOs, you said, is in fact negative for this index for what we're measuring. We try pretty hard to have all this be inputs, not outputs. So we're not measuring end results of something. We're measuring inputs and how these organizations impact those inputs. However you want to evaluate those inputs.
Right. So then, sorry, I just want to make that comment to start. But then the other question I had was, if you disaggregate the various components, so you've got multiple components of the scale, it seems that you could get a more finely honed story about what's actually going on here. Because it's one kind of story if all of this is being driven by the government spending component. that's a very different kind of causal account than if you really are becoming less open to trade or other things like that. And looking just at the scores on the index, you can't tell which of those is really going on. So have you looked at each of the 4 components separately? Because if you do that, that might add a little more kind of causal depth to what's driving things.
Well, I didn't do all 5, but I did do. This is free. This is the freedom to trade.
Right.
So if I mean, if it seems like if there is going to be a straightforward story where my intuition, initial intuition was true about how the relationships work here, it would have worked with that guy right there having positive effects. And it doesn't. It has effects that basically mirror the overall index.
Right.
Now, I could break this down even more into the subcomponents of how we measure it. And I actually tried that, but it just seemed like that created a mess. And one of the things that Professor Lawson talks about in breaking down the index further and further and further is that the way we kind of look at each of the variables that we have, so we have actually a wide array of things in Area 4. We have tariff rates. We have visas, how easy it is for people from other countries to obtain a visa. We have capital controls. So we look at all these measures as being like a proxy variable almost for the overall freedom to trade, as opposed to saying that each of these individual things are what comprise your freedom to trade internationally. So that may just be my justification for not being able to drill down into the subcomponents of Area 4 to figure out what exactly is driving that negative result. But it is a long-standing position of people who have constructed the index for a long time.
I don't understand why you've got NATO in there. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, the purpose of what I did was just to see what happens, to take the purely empirical approach, where I looked at what intergovernmental organizations exist, and then which ones have a rich enough data history in order to have their regression possibly tell me anything. And
but this list is not in any way exhaustive.
No, it's not exhaustive, but it's exhaustive of the ones that have countries joining at different times and enough countries.
No, it's not.
So
You don't have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for instance.
So that's not the. So how many countries is in that?
I don't know, 15 or so, 20 maybe.
That much? Like starting with 5 and then, or 7 and then added like more.
Around 15.
I thought about 10 or 12.
12, 15.
So 15 would be just on the cusp, and if it's any less than that, and if they all joined at once, and maybe the index doesn't measure a couple of those countries, like if Macau is somehow counted or something, then that would be pretty difficult. But it was surprising to me that, like, for instance, I was unable to do OPEC. But I mean, I was working off of a large list of them and possible
OPEC by
others.
definition is a cartel.
Sorry?
OPEC by definition is a cartel.
Yeah. So and I would expect that if OPEC had a lot more countries, and I was able to measure the effects in it, then it would be a negative, and that would be my priors before even running the numbers. But these are the ones that I was able to get the sufficient data for, and if I determine Shanghai Cooperative Organization and others do have the rich enough data, I would certainly include them in this analysis.
So I think the point is, I'll raise my hand to a colleague. So I think the point is that this is a very Western-oriented scheme. You don't have developing countries, you don't have non-Western countries. I mean, you do in the UN, but I would actually ask the question, not only why do you have NATO, but why do you have the UN, which is not a trade organization? So I have a real problem with the inclusion of UN and NATO. But beyond that, you don't really specify your dependent variable. You say it's trade, but trade of what? What is the commodity? Are agricultural commodities included, for instance? Because if they are, then this whole discussion about free trade is nonsensical. Because there is no free trade in agriculture. As the Doha Round told us, at the breakdown of the Doha Round, there is no free trade. The United States doesn't have free trade in agriculture. Nobody does. So this whole idea of free trade, if you're including agriculture, it's absolutely nonsensical.
It's not volume of trade. It's not outcome variables. It's much closer to policy. So it's
Policy is to restrict agricultural trade.
yes, different countries to do that.
Non-tariff instruments to restrict agricultural trade.
Yes,
You can
and
do that to a greater or lesser extent, right? I mean, if everybody does it to some extent, I mean, tariffs can move a little higher, move a little lower, right? So there can be variation.
You know.
So there is variance to explain, right?
But-
Even if it never gets to zero.
My point is that if you, well, first of all, you didn't answer the question. Does your model include agricultural commodities?
no.
Okay. Well then, the whole question you're asking is, it's an incomplete question. It's an incomplete equation, because I don't know what the percentage of agricultural trade of total global trade is, but it's not. It is not insignificant.
But
And if you would exclude that, how can you come up with an answer? What drives free trade if you're excluding a huge percentage of overall trade?
we're not using variables like volume of agriculture or a volume of manufactured goods. We're using variables like a tariff rate, and we have like 8 variables that are like that. So and this is inclusive of both tariff rates. So it's tariff rates, mean tariff rate, standard deviation of tariff rates, percentage of tariff revenue as a percentage of trade sector. Then 2 different measures of non-tariff trade barriers, and then we have other variables on other restrictions of labor and capital.
So my general point, without getting bogged down, my general point is, if I were doing this, I would bring in non-Western organizations, and I would bring in agricultural trade to get a fuller picture. Otherwise, it seems to me like you're talking a tautology. You're focusing on Western countries and sort of asking, if Western countries join organizations, do Western countries have free trade? Well, it just doesn't seem to be an interesting question to me.
Well, I mean, it's not a tautology because I had my priors, and my priors were falsified.
So the next point I was going to ask you about is, are we trade inter-country or intra-organization or inter? In other words, when you talk about the OECD, are you talking about OECD trade among members or non-members as well?
It's all countries. So it's the average overall tariff. It's everyone. So what OECD
at a single variable, a tariff. That's it.
No, so we have area 4. We can bring. Maybe I should have brought more information on the index with me. But so there are numerous other ways that we measure freedom to trade internationally, which I just mentioned. And what we have with OECD is just whether or not you are a member and its effects over time.
Okay. So let's go back to the WTO then, using that same comment. So how do you treat countries, for instance, post-Soviet countries, that joined the WTO at different times, but yet they have transitional periods to get to full compliance? That is to say, their tariff rates will be higher and go down over time. You have a dichotomy. You have yes, no, 0, 1. And that's very crude, and I don't think you can draw much from that, because tariff policies, tariff rates change over time according to each country's transitional period. So how do you treat that?
It is just treated as a whether or not you're in the organization. And
so that's going to skew your results then.
The question isn't but the question ultimately for hypothesis testing is whether it does so in a biased way. And I don't like maybe there is a systematically biased way that's skewing it upwards and downwards, but it's not immediately clear to me.
So my next comment, so your question is what causes free trade, and the flip side of that is what causes protectionism, and you asked for other variables. Other things that I think would be useful to consider are, that comes from the literature, as economic conditions in a country decline, that's an impetus to increase protectionism. As a country's comparative advantage declines, that drives protectionism. As group influence varies, either groups that want protection, their influence goes down, or groups that don't want protectionism, whether their influence is going up and down. So you can look at various groups and whether their stance is increasing or decreasing with regard to protectionism. Nationalism, I think, is something that needs to be taken into account. I work on Russia, and certainly Russian trade policy is nationalism. I don't know how you would quantify that, but it's certainly a big factor. And then the last thing I didn't hear you, my last point would be I didn't hear you mention Milner's work. She argues that there's an inverse relationship between integration and protectionism. So you may want to look at her work. She has a book, Resisting Protection.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I have several questions, but let me pick up one of them. That is the micro foundation of the kind of story of this, or a possible story of this finding. That is actually, regarding Luigi and Steve's concerns. Actually, I found it interesting that you include NATO, and then NATO has a more positive effect than others, right? And one thing that I thought of is that so your dependent variable is economic policy, right? So
we like to think of it as economic institutions, but they're policies that are reflective of the institutions.
So and then in order to establish an institution, in order to make policies, you need to have kind of like you need to have domestic politics that makes it possible, right? So roughly saying there are there is a division between reformists and conservatives in the country, and the reformists try to make economic policy more free. What would support the reformists? Because reformists usually face the backlash to the reform, and then, what happened, for example, in the Eastern European countries? They are told that the condition to be in the NATO, which would give them security, is committed to democratization and marketization, right? So then that would, I can easily imagine that had an impact on empowering the reformists against the backlash, against the conservatives who try to protect the vested interests, right? So, so that's actually probably one possible explanation, like a story at the micro foundation of this finding. So that's why, the international institution that provides the security to the country which has to be committed to the reform. International institution or the membership of the IGO may have that kind of impact. And then the most recent example that I know is why the Vietnam joined the negotiation of the TPP. And they said, as long as I know, in 2012, China was more aggressive in the South China Sea, and then Vietnam was originally divided between the reformists and pro-US versus pro-China, and then pro-US was empowered by the China's aggression, ironically, and then they decided to join the TPP to provide the security to the Vietnam, and so that's actually one possible story that is going on behind your finding.
Yeah, that actually does make sense. It makes me suspect possibly that that the effect with NATO doesn't go negative. It just might taper out over time. But that's something I hadn't thought of.
Clarifying question: is this net effect means net additional effect, or so if it is net additional effect, then as long as it's positive, it's getting better and better. But
sorry, it's not. These shouldn't be interpreted as an integral. It's this is just the dummy plus, so the dummy times the coefficient for the dummy plus the logged effect. So it's the logged effect and the dummy together. So
it's not additive each year.
Yeah, it's not additive each year. It's just that. Yeah, it's a PDF, not CDF. So I mean, it's not like NATO is super positive over time. The estimate was that I don't know, in year 50 it would eventually go negative, but or perhaps in this case it's never negative, and enforcing and getting these buy-in from these countries in support of conservatives, or not conservatives in this country, but reformers, would actually be beneficial. And it's incorrect to say that some of these do have positive or negative effects in the long run.
One question on that. I mean, earlier you mentioned those are not asymptotic, but golly, they look pretty asymptotic. I mean, they really flatten out. So are you sort of exaggerating the bad news story here a little bit?
Well,
I'm serious. We're talking about fractional differences which go out for 20 years, and it's just basically limits.
And it's still 0.2 or something.
Yeah. I mean, most of the action happens in the first 3 years, and then it seems like a flat line.
Well, that's just that's sort of the result of me choosing, and I chose basically logs because it's intuitive to use logs. But it might just go to 0. But when you take these things, even if they look like they're small and they're staying positive for a long time, where's the United States? When I apply these numbers to the United States is widening, not collapsing together. So
yeah, but the United States would be different, right? Because like countries found United Nations or NATO valuable because U.S. is a member.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if these numbers are completely applicable to the United States. I'm just using the United States as an example of a country where the effects truly are borne out for a long period of time, and what it looks like in the long run.
The gap goes from like 0.9 to like 1.3 over 32 years.
Yeah.
It's not a big spread. It's pretty stable in terms of the spread between the counterfactual and what you did.
It does change a little bit depending on what the specification is. A previous specification had an even bigger gap growing over time, so it might be sensitive to that.
But clearly, most of the action is at the beginning,
Right.
Right? I mean, the first decision to join.
Yes, but then there's the issue or the concern that lots of those effects initially are positive. Actually, it just looks like in the long run we get more negative than positive.
But the long run might be.
I just can't help but think that the results would be completely different, and I mean the word completely different, if you included agricultural commodities.
But so, as I was saying at the beginning of the talk, that what I was looking to achieve is to look at this economic freedom index. One of the components of which is essentially trade policy and the ability, the legal possibility for people to move across borders or goods to move across borders. That's one component of what we call economic freedom. The overall levels of trade we stay away from entirely.
You guys are talking past each other, I think. You include policy with regard to agricultural commodities, right? Tariffs on agricultural commodities would be included.
Yes.
Yeah. He's just not including the volume of agricultural trade, but the index does include policy with regard to agricultural trade.
I understand.
And to your point there is that GATT and WTO made very little progress
Exactly.
on agriculture, so that policy doesn't have much of a
Much of an effect.
But we do capture that, but because that increases the standard deviation of the tariff rate. So if you had a bunch of things that were 10% at one point, or roughly 10%, and then a bunch drop to 1, and you still have a quarter of them at 10, then we're going to be picking up on a part of that, saying that you're still having protectionist policies in this way.
But the other problem I have is, there's policy statements and there's reality. So the United States has an open, our trade policy is open free trade. But that's a lie. It simply isn't true. And so you can have policy statements that belie reality. For instance, sugar imports.
Yeah,
we have enormously high tariffs.
Right, but then we capture that.
Yeah, we capture that.
No, because he has policy.
No, we measure the average tariff rate.
Yeah, the law. They're captured. They're measured what the actual law is.
What if the barrier isn't a tariff? What if it's a quota?
We have non-tariff trade barriers, and we have other regulatory restrictions that we use from World Economic Forum, I believe. Whatever exists for a wide number of countries and goes back any amount of time, we include in the index on trade. To try to capture all these other dimensions, we might miss one of the dimensions, but hopefully it's correlated with the other dimensions. So the general picture that we have is still correct.
But I think that you should one of the comments you made is to include either integration agreements that you do have at the regional level in Africa, Asia, Latin America, is important because some of these trade agreements actually tend to be, according to economic theory, trade deviation, because basically what they force these countries to trade among each other and exclude other countries' imports. And I think because actually it's got a point in the sense that it's a very Western sort of bias in the way you look at trade.
I do actually recall now that I was messing around with the primary trade group in Africa, and the data just wasn't there to do it. So I mean, the fact that what I'm measuring as explanatory variables have a Western bias, that's just because that's what we have data for, and where there's enough variation.
When you talk about data, what is it? I mean, if you look at Mercosur, it's been around for a long time. Do you include it?
Well, can you say that again?
Mercosur, the South American.
It's been around since 1992.
Okay.
I mean,
And different countries have joined at different times. as
over
well.
time.
Okay, I'll have to look at that one more closely. I may have missed that.
Brian, what was your objection to the World Bank and IMF?
That's a good question. I'll have to look at that again. I don't recall why I didn't.
Well, I have a question about so I think this is related to Matthew's question, and then also somehow related to Steve's point. That is, there is an argument by Danny Roderick, right, and others, and so if the country is open for trade, then the country tends to increase the government expenditure because they have to cover the losers, compensate the losers of the free trade. So, but in your index, so economic freedom, so it will increase the government expenditure and yet lowering the trade barrier. So, and then that may be cancelled out if you do not distinguish them, right?
Yeah.
So that's actually one thing that I would like to consider when you interpret the result, and then that may be that may explain why OECD countries more recently has more negative impact than the positive, because actually government increase in the government expenditure tends to happen in developed countries. That's actually the follower of the Roderick's argument have said recently.
Okay, so it's really what we're getting at is the interaction between the Area 1 sides of government and Area 4 freedom to trade.
Right.
Well, but so if that's the case, then it would be the positive of Area 4 being canceled out by the negative of Area 1. But it seems like if anything that there's negative effects from an Area 4 that don't need to be canceled out unless size of government is also going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, because OECD is a group of the country that only has developed countries, so it may have more impact of increasing the government expenditure. That's what I thought.
Okay. And these that coefficient, I mean, that's going to go negative in 10 years or something. So, I think that is.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I have some real concerns about the United Nations variable. And the reason is because the group of countries that aren't part of the United Nations are a sort of odd and small lot, right? I mean, so therefore, if you're using membership in the United Nations as a predictor, that may be driven by these kind of weird outlier cases, because overwhelmingly the norm is to be a member of the United Nations, right? You don't have a lot of exceptions to that.
If I can jump in.
Sure.
But they're all dummied out because there's country fixed effects. So everything's being built on countries that joined, essentially.
So okay, so then when they join the UN, there's this negative effect. Okay.
Well, not in the 1 year, but on average, the years that they're a member is less than the ones that they weren't a member.
Yeah. Okay, so then here that actually then feeds into the other thing I was going to say.
Okay.
So, when obviously you're presenting what is, you said to yourself and to everybody else, going to be a counterintuitive result, right? This is not what people would expect. And so obviously whenever you have a counterintuitive result, you're going to get a lot of pushback and a lot of claims of spuriousness because, people's natural intuition is going to be, there's something else going on here. There's something, and I know part of your reason of presenting this is to get other stories about what might be going on here. But if in fact you do think that there's a real relationship here, not something spurious, but in fact that this is in fact a true causal story, I think it would be helpful if you were able to choose a couple of case studies, illustrative case studies, to show how the story played out in a real context, to say, here's an example of a country. They joined these international organizations. This is what happened in their policy trajectory that made them less free. Because then people could start to say, aha, I see how that would play out, right? I see where what you're driving at, the kinds of choices that countries make after joining these organizations that make them economically less free. That might give people a little more of a kind of plausibility hook to hang their hat on in buying into the results. So just a suggestion, if you could find a couple of exemplar cases that follow the trajectory of your model and that you could put a little contextual meat on the bone.
Not just context, but nuance and detail. I'm not sure you can get to where you want to go based on indexes. I think they're so crude. I think they're so crude that they hurt you more than they hurt.
I wouldn't get rid of the indices, but I think if you can pair them
But
with...
as your sole basal sort of data,
Right.
I don't buy it. But I like your idea of R. I think that's really good.
But again, not just context. I mean, do the qualitative deep dive on this case. I mean, walk us through the causal story on how this actually happened.
Because then you could convince people, okay, I see plausibly now how this story would play out,
Yeah.
right? I see how in a country this causal trajectory could work with specific policy decisions. I think you could get a lot of more buy-in from that, unless you yourself decide what I've basically got here is a spurious result, and I'm trying to figure out
Well,
why.
it's a way of testing the result, right? It's a way of testing this in reality, if you're serious about it.
Well, it would be. Well, I mean, the issue is that when you're looking at everything ceteris paribus, it could just be that a country was on a path to improve and it stagnated, and it may seem obvious, in 2015 that they should have stagnated, and people have a received view of why it stagnated, and none of it involves, say, the UN. So it seems like even if I'm choosing ones that line up directly on the regression line, telling a persuasive story often may seem difficult.
Well, but you ought then to be able to identify certain policy choices that were less free than they otherwise would have been because of pressures from organizational membership. If you can point to some of those cases, then that would be useful.
A perfect example would be Turkey.
So
That was, was perfectly on route joining and opening markets in order to join NATO, and then the promise, the carrot was always hanging.
EU.
Yeah, the EU. Sorry, I apologize. Yeah, the EU.
But they didn't actually join the EU.
No.
No, but it was.
The EU made a number of preconditions to join.
Right.
So that's what it's referring to.
Okay.
And other good examples are like East European countries like Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. How they advanced the economic reform, domestic economic reform, along with the precondition of the membership of NATO. And then many people say about they wanted to be a member of EU because EU is an economic institution, but much fewer people are talking about the relationship with conditionality to be a member of NATO through the commitment to the economic reform. So that will be interesting.
Yeah, that's.
I would say, pursuant to what Hiroki and Matt said, you need to move beyond the unitary state actor as your unit of analysis, and you really need to get into group influence. I mean, trade policy is largely determined by lobbies. You're going to have to get into that at some level of detail.
Going back to intellectual property, it occurs to me that the membership of WIPO, we find it to include a lot more developing countries than a a lot of these organizations. It's also an economically focused organization, unlike the United Nations. And, you know, it's been in existence quite a long time, so it would be interesting to see what the trajectory.
The name of it, I'm sorry.
World Intellectual Property Organization
Okay.
has many more developing countries than
Okay. I'll look to include that.
Any parting wisdom, ideas, questions? Okay, well then I think that's it. Thank you very much, Ryan, and good luck with the work as you move forward.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
It was interesting, actually. I'm currently working on the TPP, so you know, this is particularly interesting. I found that many countries join the TPP or are joining the TPP for kind of security implication that TPP may bring. So that's why I raised that question. It was kind of Vietnam, and was the case, and then also now Taiwan. That clearly says, you know, to hedge the risk of the dependence on China, they would like be interested in the TPP.
Yeah, and I guess now that we can read the text, I guess it would actually be interesting to figure out if you know.